I wonder what an analyst review of Docker orchestration services would look like by someone who wasn't paid to give their opinion. Huh. Welcome everybody to Curious Tech. And today we're making a couple magic quadrants for Docker orchestration services. We're going to talk about comparing and contrasting a few different things you might consider when using a Docker orchestration service, and then taking a few of the technologies that are in the landscape, plotting them on the map, and kind of getting a feel for where they fit relative to one another. This is all my opinion, highly subjective, but based on some good experience. And take this opportunity as well to comment below and let me know how you would rank these. Let me know if you think I'm missing something, because not only will I learn something, but the rest of the community will.
Let's talk about a few of our options: Docker Compose, Ansible Docker, Swarm, Nomad, Kubernetes, and Openshift. First thing to note here is Docker Compose is not really a Docker orchestration service, and Ansible Docker can allow you to do some orchestration through configuration management and Git operations, but there's no dynamic operations here. So it's not managing itself. You, the operator, are managing it. So you could think of it as orchestration light. And then those kind of compare against these four main services, just to sort of get a feel for how they work. And the reason you want to make those comparisons between those services that don't really fit is sometimes you'll figure out that your use case just doesn't call for taking on the extra work of building, managing, and maintaining an orchestration service, when maybe one of these other non-orchestration services are really what you need. All right, and that's really the mindset you got to have when you're looking at pieces of technology. So let's talk about it: complexity versus scalability. Well, Docker Compose is not scalable, right? It runs on a single host. In Ansible Docker, it's really only scalable via configuration. So you need to mentally map out how everything's going to talk to each other, make sure that ports that need to be public are public, how are they going to find each other, and all of that needs to be mapped into your configuration. Now, because it's Ansible, you can do some things like template configurations and dynamically filling in values in the template configs. So that can take a lot of the heavy lifting off of wiring it up, so to speak, together. But at the end of the day, you got to figure a lot of that out and manage the configuration. When we start talking about Swarm, that's the first time we talk about orchestration across hosts. The thing that's interesting here is Swarm uses the same specification as Docker Compose, since it was made by the Docker team. So if you start out doing some single host Docker activities, going from Docker Compose to Swarm, like that transition is pretty straightforward, as there's not much complexity difference there. And then from there, we jump into the big boys, Nomad, and then really the elephant in the room being Kubernetes. These ones, Nomad and Kubernetes, there's a number of good studies out there with very, very large clusters. You're talking about 5,000 in the 10,000 node clusters or container clusters. So just really highly scalable, being able to do multi-data center, multi-cluster. And so when you talk about scalability, those are the main ones. And I didn't mention Openshift because Openshift really is Red Hat's wrapper around Kubernetes. So it has some opinionated nature and it has some additional features. But at the end of the day, it's a version of Kubernetes, and therefore is able to sort of piggyback off of the scalability that Kubernetes brings you. When you're looking at technology in this complexity versus scalability space, Nomad, Swarm, and somewhat to a degree Ansible Docker are interesting because how much work it takes to get a lot of results, right? And even I think Ansible Docker is kind of a push when you start comparing that to Docker Compose and Swarm, just kind of sitting in the middle of them. So really focusing in on Swarm and Nomad. Lots of scalability, not so much complexity. Some of these other tools, you need, additional scripts, additional tools to help you figure out how to get them running. And these tools are just so straightforward. You can get them up quite quickly. The biggest gap between going from Swarm to Nomad is if you've got Docker Compose stuff already written and you go to Swarm, right? That's almost an instant switch. Whereas if you're going to Nomad, you got to think about mapping configuration. So if you're talking about just keeping it as low from a complexity perspective as possible, Swarm's interesting. And also recognizing that if your cluster's not going to be that big and you don't need that much scalability, all of a sudden you could be in a Goldilocks zone. All right, comparing market share is kind of a joke. First thing I have to say is this graph is not drawn to scale because Kubernetes dominates it. Well, in over 90-something% of the market share runs on Kubernetes. Now, whether or not Kubernetes fits everybody's use case properly or not, it doesn't matter. Kubernetes is king when it comes to market share. And because it's king, there's a lot out there. There's a lot of blog posts. There's a lot of utilities to try to help with the ease of deployment and the ease of management of the infrastructure. There's managed services that take almost all of the complexity it takes to have a Kubernetes cluster away, giving you the instant scalability and just eating the number one issue with the value proposition of Kubernetes, which is the complexity. So from that perspective, Kubernetes really is in a land of its own. Some of these other technologies, for example, I talk about Nomad and how big of a cluster it is. You can create with it, or even Openshift, right? Those technologies are borderline foreign compared to Kubernetes. Most people have never even used them, don't know much about them, don't even know they exist, right? You talk about services like Nomad. It's not limited to the Docker space. You could actually think of it as not a container orchestrator, but a service orchestrator. Which opens up some really fascinating choices and opportunities. However, Kubernetes is king in this space. So understanding that when you have that kind of market dominance, then you get a lot of community support, and that has a ton of value. And not just community support. If you want enterprise support, you can find people who are willing to give that to you, sell it to you, etc. So when you go on a path less traveled, you got to recognize that comes with a cost. So behind the scenes, one of my points here was really about evaluating technologies, right? It's not in the title of the video. It may not have been clear, but I also think it's really a cool thing to think about. Just looking at these from two different perspectives, we can shape these up to have some very different winners. And if you continue to add more perspectives, or if you continue to add more dimensions, then you could end up with some different winners. And as you look at those dimensions, some of those dimensions may be far more important to solving your use case, solving your problems. And all of a sudden, things that might seem like a foregone conclusion as it's going to be the technology winner may not even be close to the right solution for you. So it's usually really a good idea to sort of take these technologies, figure out what dimensions you care about, do your best to understand how the technologies fit into those different landscapes, and weight them. And one of the things that I always like to do when I'm comparing things like this is part of it be a small experiment. So spin them up, try it, time box it, and use part of that to influence your weighting decision. And when you're done, you may not be picking the technology you thought you were going to pick. You may not pick the technology that is the biggest winner. And it may end up paying some really, really huge dividends for your team or for your project because you picked the right tool for the right job and for the right team and for the right time, right? If you had a different point in time, you might have picked a different tool, but the right tool for the right team at the right time. And that could have some really powerful effects. So what are we looking at here? Kubernetes, Nomad, cool technology, Swarm. They all, in my opinion, each one of them has their place and the right time to use each of them. Kubernetes is king, so recognizing the market share, but there are opportunities for some of these other technologies when you really understand their value propositions. I hope this was interesting. I look forward to seeing your thoughts in the comment below. We've got plenty more content queued up between now and the end of the year. Stick with us. We're going to be releasing content fairly regularly after this summer break. So look forward to see you guys in the comments. Thank you.